Okay, let's get started. At the microphones, maybe start over there.
Okay. Well, what this suggests is that maybe for the people of Latin America, their only hope is in a strategy of, say, Sendero Luminoso, which also suggests that maybe we've been getting a distorted picture of Sendero.
Well, I don't think that does everybody know what Sendero Luminoso is? This is it's a kind of a Maoist guerrilla movement in Peru, which is pretty murderous. I think we have a fair, yeah, you're right. You always want to question what you read and hear, but in this case, I think it's really pretty ugly. On the other hand, Sendero Luminoso has a lot of support. There's just no doubt that it's got a lot of popular support, and that support appears to be growing. In fact, it's right into the main cities now. Personally, I don't think that's the right way. I think the right way is the way that was tried in Central America. And if it failed, it's our fault. We can sit around and tell people how you have to be nonviolent and all that nice stuff. But if we don't do anything about it, they can't be nonviolent. They got to be brutal murderers. The Central American way was very hopeful. It was just the right way, and we let it get destroyed. But it's still the right way, and that's our fault, and we just have to stop letting it get destroyed.
I wanted to raise a question about the basic assessment that the United States won in Vietnam or in Indochina and is on the winning side in Nicaragua. That is, while you say the goal of the United States is to prevent the model of successful economic development controlled by the people as well as to inoculate the country, there's another goal of U.S. policy, which is to destroy the example of a country saying we're going to run ourselves. And they failed on that score in Vietnam, and they failed in Nicaragua. And in failing, it seems to me that example became the more powerful because of the efforts that the United States waged, because of the 500,000 troops that it had in Vietnam. When it lost the Vietnam War, it then gave rise to the overthrow of the Portuguese and their colonies in Africa, ultimately to Nicaragua, which took advantage of the U.S. defeat, took advantage of anti-war sentiment in the United States, and took power. And I think that while, as you explained, Nicaragua is still fighting, the United States has failed to reestablish its rule over Nicaragua. The people are still in the saddle in Nicaragua, albeit beaten down in poverty. And my feeling is that the rise of struggles in El Salvador today, the failure, for example, of the United States to move in on Panama, the fact that there would be 2,000 people here today, all of that is testimony to victories for our side in the midst of the tremendous crushing burden of the United States. So I'd like to hear your comment on that.
Well, I think there's a lot of truth to that, but there's only one part of what you said where I don't agree, and it's a matter of judgment, so you got to figure out what you think. But the one part of what you said that I don't agree with, it's not the way it looks to me, is that the success of the Vietnamese in holding on inspired others to do the same. I don't think that was the lesson. I think if you look, there was no connection between Vietnam and what happened to the Portuguese Empire. That was unraveling independently for other reasons. And in fact, I think the lesson people drew from Vietnam is that if you try to stand up against the global enforcer, you're going to get murdered. Now, as far as still people do it because they're willing to struggle, despite the lesson that they learned. Now, the way I would look, apart from that, I think the United States did suffer one major defeat at home. That's absolutely right, and I'm glad you mentioned it. The United States is a very different country from what it was 25 years ago, or even the peak of the peace movement. A very different country. I know just from my own experience, talks like the one I gave tonight, I couldn't give anywhere at the peak of the peace movement, even to peace movement activist circles, because it would sound insane. Now I give talks like this anywhere in the country, everywhere. Quite honestly, I gave a talk like this in the State Department last year, literally, at the open forum in the State Department. And the point is the country has just changed. It's possible, it's just a completely different, the country is out of control. And that's very important, and that is defeat for power. We ought to make it a bigger defeat, but that's a change, and that's important. Now, as far as U.S. planners are concerned, they do want to keep the domestic population under control, and that they're not doing too well at. Thank goodness. We got to make sure they do less well at it. As far as Vietnam is concerned, I don't think you can answer simply the question whether it was a victory or defeat. They had larger goals and they had minimal goals. They achieved the minimal goals. They didn't achieve the larger goals. The larger goals were to reincorporate Indochina within the U.S.-dominated global system, and that they did not achieve. But the basic goal, the crucial one, the one that really counted, was to destroy the virus, and I think that one they did achieve. It's not a model that anybody in Southeast Asia is trying to follow. In fact, it's a basket case. And that's a big victory for the United States, and as I say, we're trying very hard to keep it that way, even to the extent of supporting Pol Pot. Now, in the case of Central America, I think it's still going on, so you can't judge, and I think the outcome depends a lot on what happens among the population in the United States. If the population in the United States lets American policy go on, I think you can predict quite readily what's going to happen. It's going to win. It's going to succeed in destroying the possibility of recovery, I think. I think it's going to succeed in destroying the possibility of any kind of recovery. And the United States will do that if that's necessary in order to prevent successful independent development. Remember that the United States has long-term goals for Central America. I didn't get into this, but this is part of much broader planning. For years, the world has been drifting into three major competitive blocs. There's a kind of a yen-based bloc, which is around, has Japan as its center, and the former Japanese colonies in the periphery. And as Japan, to the surprise of everybody, recovered because of the Korean War and then the Vietnam War, which they made a huge profit on, this system began to reconstitute itself. There's a European-based bloc, which is taking a big step forward in 1992 with the European Common Market. And remember, Europe is a serious competitor. Europe, if it ever gets its act together, is richer than the United States, has a bigger population than the United States, more educated population. If they become an integrated power, the United States is second-class power. So that's another development. And the third one is the dollar-based bloc. That has recently been extended. That was the major purpose of the free trade agreement with Canada, to incorporate Canada, which is our major trading partner, basically in the U.S. system as a colony. And I think that was probably achieved in the last Canadian election. It will now play itself out. The same is true of Mexico, at least those parts of Mexico that are, where there's U.S.-based industry around the north and so on. And the Caribbean Basin Initiative was intended as something like that. The Caribbean Basin Initiative, and that includes El Salvador, even though it's not on the Caribbean. That Caribbean Basin Initiative, meaning Central America and the Caribbean, was intended to create something for the United States like what Japan has been developing in its periphery, Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, and so on. Whether they can do that, I don't know, but it's plain that independence in those regions is inconsistent with that. And I think the world will probably drift, and that's been drifting in that direction for years. You can see the tendencies continuing. What that would lead to, nobody knows. Maybe that's the kind of thing which in the past has led to global war. Maybe there's enough interconnection among the great powers now to keep that from happening. But that means there's going to be a real drive to block successful development in Central America and the Caribbean, even to the extent, if it's necessary, of just virtually decimating the places. Now, it doesn't have to happen. People there are struggling. I don't know how they continue to do it, frankly. I've never understood how people can continue to struggle against this kind of brutality, but they do somehow. And the question is whether we provide them enough margin for survival, but that depends on what happens here. So, to get back to your point, which I think is right to the point, the biggest defeat that U.S. power suffered, apart from the fact that it didn't achieve its major aims in these places, is at home. And that's the one that's under our control, fortunately, so you can do something about it.
Is the Peace Corps used as a political?
Can't hear you.
Is the Peace Corps used as a political tool to promote economic interests abroad?
Well, the Peace Corps was intended to be the sort of benign face of the death squads. I'm not saying the Peace Corps is a bad thing. quite honestly, I think the Peace, not anymore because they've changed it, but the Peace Corps for a long time was a very healthy thing. Frankly, I doubt that the Peace Corps did much good to the countries where the people worked, but I think it did a lot of good in the United States. People who went to third world countries learned something about the world, and they brought what they learned home, and that made a difference. A lot of those people became activists, in fact. They learned something about what the world is really like, and how much, maybe some of them helped, maybe they didn't. It's hard to help, it just isn't that easy. But whatever they did, they helped the United States, and that's good. They helped make it a more civilized place.
Do you think the arrest of John Hull in Costa Rica will have any ramifications on the North trial, or is it just the culling of a bad apple to keep the barrel alive?
It's an interesting question. The question was about the arrest of John Hull in Costa Rica. Was that reported here? Yeah? It's interesting because the New York Times didn't report it. Yeah, it's very interesting. New York Times didn't report it. John Hull, who's this, American rancher U.S. rancher up in northern Costa Rica, and his big CIA asset, he was right in the center of the Contra thing. He was detained, I think, for questioning. I don't think he was actually arrested by the Costa Rican government for questioning with regard to his activities in the North Network. The question was whether that's going to affect the North trial. My own guess is not. I don't think anybody with any power I think they want the North thing to go away. It was sort of embarrassing you couldn't, see, that whole North story was perfectly well known before the Iran-Contra hearings. I don't say that in retrospect. I take a look at my book, Turning the Tide. I wrote about it in there. That was 1985, and I don't have any access to anything except public sources. Everybody knew about the North Network. You might not have known all the details and so on, but the main story was perfectly well known. It was known to the media. It was known to Congress. They just chose to look the other way. There were congressional hearings in March or April 1986, that's well before the story broke, in which most of the thing came out. It was all over the wires, the AP wires, congressmen were saying, my God, I never knew it was this bad, and so on and so forth. Nothing appeared. You could keep up the lid on it. The same was true about the shipment of arms to Iran, incidentally. That did not begin when the Iran-Contra hearing said it began. It didn't begin in 1985. It began almost immediately after the fall of the Shah. It began in 1980. It was done in exactly the way it was always done. It was done through Israel, which was the main contact. By 1982, long before the Iran-Contra hearings, Israel was providing probably about half of the arms for Iran, and that was public knowledge. You could read it at the front page of the New York Times. Furthermore, the top Israeli government official said exactly what it was about. The ambassador, Moshe Ahrens, who was in the United States, gave interviews in the United States in October 1982, in which he said, Israel is sending arms to Iran, the Khomeini regime, with the cooperation of the United States, I'm quoting him, at almost the highest level. That's diplomatic talk for everybody except Ronald Reagan, who everyone knows doesn't know what policy is. But it means all policy at the highest level. It was sending arms to Iran for the purpose of trying to organize a military coup. The main Israeli figures who were involved later in the Iran-Contra hearings, David Kimche and Yaakov Nimrodi, the whole bunch of them, they all appeared on BBC television in February 1982, and they described in some detail how they were involved in organizing an arms flow to the Khomeini regime in order to try to set up contacts with military officers who could then overthrow the regime and restore the convenient arrangement that existed under the Shah. And in that same BBC program, Richard Helms, who was former head of the CIA and also U.S. ambassador to Iran, and Robert Comer of the Pentagon, said they didn't know for sure that was going on, but obviously it ought to be going on. Now that is very closely related to what I was talking about. One aspect of this long understanding that you have to establish relations with the military in other countries is that if a country gets out of hand, you try to establish relations with its military. That's one of the ways to overthrow it. That's the way Allende was overthrown. In fact, that's the way the Suharto coup took place. The whole time that we're right before the Suharto coup, the coup in Indonesia that I mentioned, throughout that whole time we were very hostile to Indonesia, and we were sending arms to them the whole time. There's no contradiction there. Same with Allende. Obviously very hostile to Allende. We were sending arms to them the whole time. You do it all the time. That you send arms to, because that's the way you establish relations with the right colonels and so on, who will overthrow the government for you. You give them goodies, arms and stuff. And undoubtedly that's what we were doing with Iran, way back in the early 80s. In 1984 or so, the Israeli contacts were caught and executed. We know that from Israeli sources. After that, the North Casey network just picked the story up. Just picked it up all over again and tried to reestablish the same context. I don't think there's any doubt that that's the real story. And as I say, it was all known. I mean, I wrote about it in a book that appeared in 1983. It's all known, nothing secret. So what happened in the Iran-Contra hearings? Well, what happened is that a moment came when it was just impossible to keep it under cover. When the Hassenfuss plane was shot down, American mercenary shot down in Nicaragua, you couldn't pretend it didn't happen. There's pictures of this guy being carted around. And then Lebanese newspaper and the Iranian government reported that the national security advisor was walking around Tehran handing out Bibles and chocolate cakes. You can't keep it quiet anymore. You can't pretend you don't know. So at that point, you move to the next phase, damage control. Try to keep it under control. And that's what the Iran-Contra hearings were about. But now that damage control's been completed, you don't want anything more to come out. So I think it's pretty safe to suppose that the North trial and all the other trials will drift away. Why Costa Rica apprehended Hull, I don't know. I mean, I think Costa Rica plays a very complex role in all these things. Costa Rica depends for its survival on a huge U.S. subsidy. I mean, it's one of the most heavily subsidized countries in the world, and they know perfectly well that they're paid off only as long as they more or less stay in line. They have little twitters of independence now and then, but not much. Arias in particular has been very subordinate to U.S. policy. And why they did that, I don't know.
And clearly, it's refreshing. I really appreciate it. I wanted to ask you, what is a person to do? You implied, I think you used the word disruptive internally. What can we do? I gather writing letters isn't enough. Voting isn't enough. We need to get out and march like we did in the Vietnam days. Is that what you're saying?
Well, nothing is enough, but I think voting is sometimes meaningful, depends on the situation. Writing letters is often meaningful. It's surprising what a few letters to a congressperson might do sometimes. Demonstrations can be very meaningful. But the main thing is it's got to be sustained. It's got to be sustained and organized. The point is that anybody in any country, take the country you like, you'll find some group that has real power, and they got to make sure that everybody else is quiet. I mean, that's the way power works. If people are not quiet, if they're not apathetic, it's a cost that has to be paid because you don't want power challenged. Now, power, it's not a big secret where power is in the United States. Power basically lies in the hands of people who are in a position to determine investment decisions, what's produced, what's distributed, and so on. It lies in a pretty narrow corporate elite. They staff the government by and large. They run the ideological institutions. They keep everything going. And one of the things they want is a passive, quiescent population. So one of the things that you can do to make life uncomfortable for them is not be a passive, quiescent population. And there are lots of ways of doing that. Even asking questions is considered an unacceptable cost. Take the hysteria about the universities in the 1960s, the whole Alan Bloom business. What are these guys so upset about? I mean, they act as if the world was coming to an end. What was happening is that students were asking questions, That's the main thing that was happening. They were just refusing to obey, to follow and copy down every stupid thing they were told. They wanted to think about things and ask questions and so on. And that was considered an intolerable threat to order. I mean, that's now described, you read Alan Bloom's bestseller, it's described as if it was like the Nazis taking over, And that's exactly the way people in the faculty club perceived it. It's not that they're exaggerating. They perceived it that way. I watched it at the time. You know, students are supposed to be obedient. They're not supposed to think. You know, they're not supposed to. They're supposed to do what they're told. You know, and be obedient and be nice kids and pick up and run the place the next generation. If they don't do that, that's a problem. You know, and you got to do something about it. And the same. This goes all the way to direct resistance. You know, the Vietnam War, the resistance to the war was quite significant. That was a cost. And there's no answer. Nothing is. I mean, you ask what's enough. The answer is nothing is enough. I mean, nothing will ever be enough until the institutional structures are changed. As long as that doesn't happen, it's going to continue. What we're just seeing is going to continue to go on. And I think they ought to be changed. I mean, I quite frankly think we have to realize the ideals of the American Revolution, which have not been realized, in my opinion. But that's another story. Short of changing the institutions, there's a lot of ways of acting, including the ones you mentioned and others, but it only makes a difference if you keep it up. You go to one demonstration and then you go home, that's something, but they can live with that. What they can't live with is sustained organizations that just keep doing things and keep building, and where people learn more and, you know, learn lessons from the last time and do it better next time and reach others and so on. That's no good. And it's not just letters to Congress, it's also pressure on the newspapers and everything else. Any system of power, even if it's a fascist dictatorship, is going to be responsive to public dissidence. And it's certainly true in a country like this, where the state doesn't have a lot of force to coerce people, fortunately.
Yes, many younger Americans were initiated into the reality of the shadowy aspects of American history and politics during the recent revelations regarding top officials and covert activity in gun and drug running. You recently just spoke of the Iran-Contra hearings. This seamy aspect of American history and politics is new to many young people and is rarely discussed in right-wing corporate media and educational institutions. This information, while scholarly, is also marginalized by many progressives with the label conspiracy theory. The Christic Institute has initiated a lawsuit against the 29 defendants, members of a secret team with linkages not only to the Iran-Contra event, but a string of other events including Watergate, various domestic and foreign assassinations, and international political and economic destabilization. How do you evaluate and judge this type of activity, and will it be helpful in our drive to impeach the former head of the secret police, now the President of the United States, and Vice President Quayle?
Well, first of all, I think what you said is correct. I mean, these things are sort of consigned to dusty archives, but most of this stuff has been known for a long time. I mean, take the involvement of the U.S. government in the drug racket. Most of that was exposed by, in a book written by a Southeast Asia scholar, several Southeast Asia scholars, Alfred McCoy and several associates. The book came out, I forget, certainly the early 70s. It was called The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia. It was sort of a scholarly study. It began in 1947 with the reconstitution of the heroin racket in France. That's actually connected to what I described a little bit in the talk. I mentioned that the first major task of the United States throughout the world was to destroy the anti-fascist resistance and to restore the old elites, often fascist collaborators in power. In France, there was a particular problem. You had to break up the labor unions. Labor unions were very powerful in France, and they had to be broken up. For one thing, because unions lead to too much democracy and popular involvement in politics and all that bad stuff. And for another thing, because the unions were impeding the flow of arms to Southeast Asia to try to, reconquer Vietnam. So that had to be broken up. Well, one of the first CIA operations was an effort jointly with top American labor leadership, incidentally, which is quite proud of it, was to split the French labor unions. And to do that, they needed goons. You want to break up strikes and that sort of thing. You need guys who will break kneecaps and, break people's heads and that sort of business. And they had to hire thugs, especially around this waterfront, Marseille and places like that. Well, who do you go to? The mafia. Now, the mafia had been put out of business by the fascists. Fascists tend to run a pretty tight ship. They don't like competing authority, like other gangsters around. So the mafia had been pretty well dispelled by the fascist governments, The Sicilian Mafia was reconstituted as the U.S. Army moved up through Italy, 1943 and 1944, as an alternative base of power. In 1947 and 48, when the CIA was moving to break the labor unions, they basically made a deal with the Corsican Mafia, which they reconstituted. Corsican Mafia was hired as goons and strikebreakers and that sort of thing. And it worked, a lot of violence on the waterfront and so on. But of course they don't do it for the fun of it. I mean, they want to be paid off. And the way they were paid off was by allowing them to reconstitute the heroin racket. That's the source of the famous French connection. Marseille was one of the centers of the world heroin racket until I think around 1970, when it sort of shifted over to Southeast Asia at that point, where it was run largely out of Laos in connection with the CIA. The CIA was running a huge secret war, so-called. It was secret, like the arms flow to Iran was secret. Everybody knew about it, but everybody was disciplined enough not to talk about it. That's exactly what happened. But the way they ran their so-called secret war was by organizing classic imperial style. They organized highland tribesmen into an army to attack the lowland Lao, and again, you got to pay them off. Well, you pay them off by letting them grow opium, but then you got to fly the opium out to markets, and they don't have planes, so the CIA provided the planes and flew them to Saigon. That's where the American Army got hooked on drugs, and then it goes out to the West. Now a lot of the flow of drugs is coming from Afghanistan. In fact, the source of drugs, for pretty much the same reasons. You trace around the history of the drug racket, it's usually located someplace where there's an insurgency and a counterinsurgency operation going on. That's the way you get a lot of money. I mean, the CIA operates with undetectable money. It's its main thing. And how do you get undetectable money? Well, usually through some racket. It's the easiest way to do it. So most of this stuff was pretty well known and well documented long before the Iran-Contra hearings, but you're right, nobody knows it. Of course, that's not the kind of thing you teach in high school and so on, but it's there. Now, as far as the Christic Institute material is concerned, you've got to look at everything with a critical eye, everything. And one of the things you've got to look at with a critical eye is the Christic Institute material. I think a lot of it's interesting. My own feeling is a lot of it is plausible but not demonstrated. Not implausible, but also not demonstrated. Now, how much of it will turn out to be true, I don't know. I mean, it's certainly interesting. A lot of the parts of it look rather quite well done. For example, there's a book by Leslie Coburn, who was an analyst for one of the television stations, I forget which one of the channels, called Out of Control. Came out a couple of years ago, which is quite a good analysis of a lot of this material, and that stuff is very solid, I think. She's a good researcher. And there's other things, too. I mean, it's sort of related to the Christic material, but I'd watch all of this stuff with a grain of salt. It's easy to be carried away by big, complicated conspiracies. Tell you, frankly, there's one aspect of the Christic Institute stuff that leaves me unconvinced, and that's the idea that there's some kind of a hijacking of the government by crazies. I don't think that's what the record shows. I don't think the record shows that there are rogue elephants around. I mean, there may be some, but they're not very important. The CIA does what it's told. The crooks of the Richard Secord, the Albert Hackham variety, they can do their things as long as the government lets them get away with it. But I think the record, at least as far as I read it, shows pretty careful central planning and control by the civilian authorities. And the idea that maybe the government was hijacked by a secret team, but I don't believe it. I think that that's not correct and probably diversionary. It turns attention away from the way the institutions themselves function. But, you've got to read it and think about it and make your own decisions. It's not easy. It's not,
And the impeachment?
Pardon?
And the impeachment?
The impeachment? Well, personally, it's, in my honest, if you want my judgment, every American president should have been impeached. And in fact, I think, legally speaking, there's a very solid case. Every American president since the Second World War is either an outright war criminal or has been involved in serious war crimes. And furthermore, the same is true of the leaders of every other state, at least every state that has enough power to do anything, like maybe not Luxembourg or something like that. But that's the nature of state power. You know.
Could you please discuss in more detail specifically what U.S. interests in Central America are? What role the news media play in securing those interests, and specifically how these interests are manifested or represented in news media content?
Sorry, I couldn't hear the last sentence. Could you repeat?
And how U.S. interests are manifested or represented in news media content?
Yeah. I was just told that we only have another minute or two, so that's a serious question. That would require a long answer, which I'm not going to have time to give. But I think the answer to it is basically given in the declassified documentary record. Now, without trying to answer, because there's no time, I have a lot of that stuff quoted in a book called On Power and Ideology, which quotes a lot of, first chapter of it quotes a lot of then recently declassified documents, and they tell it straight out. It's exactly what I said. The United States has to block the development of nationalist regimes which are responsive to the needs of their own population, because there's a higher priority. The higher priority is maintaining a favorable investment climate, protecting our resources, making sure you get profits, and so on. Now, it's not that Nicaragua, I mean, as far as American business is concerned, Nicaragua could disappear and nobody would notice it. Or the same is true of El Salvador. But the trouble is, if any of those countries begin to get somewhere, the rot will spread. That's the consistent fear. You got to bear in mind that the weaker and the poorer a country is, the more dangerous it is. It's a very striking fact that it's the weakest, poorest countries that arouse the greatest hysteria. I mean, take the hysteria over Grenada. Grenada you couldn't even find, It's like 100,000 people who produce a little nutmeg. When they began to undergo a mild social revolution, Washington went berserk. Laos is probably the poorest country in the world. Most of the people in Laos didn't even know there was such a thing as Laos. They didn't know it until the bombers came over and started driving them into the hills. They just knew they had a little village and there was another village somewhere. As soon as a very low-level social revolution began to develop in Laos, Washington went berserk. I mean, they started the biggest secret bomb, huge bombing. They wiped out the place, and that's consistently true. The attack on Nicaragua was the same, and there's a reason for that. The weaker a country is, the more dangerous it is. And it's not because its resources are important, it's because of the rotten apple effect. The point is, if even a tiny country, say Grenada, no resources, nothing, I mean, if even they can begin to do something for their own population, like maybe make a fishing cooperative with 10 people or something, some other place which has more resources will ask, why not us, So the poorer and the weaker you are, the more dangerous you are. You don't want to get a mechanical idea that it's the resources of country X that we're not willing to give up. I mean, even Indochina, which is pretty big, although Eisenhower and people like that ranted a lot about the rice and the rubber and all that stuff, that wasn't all that important. What was the danger was that if Indochina was lost to its own population and really worked, they would emulate it in Thailand. And if that worked, they'd do it in Malaya. And pretty soon you'd find Indonesia becoming independent. And pretty soon the whole Southeast Asian network would unravel. And then what would happen? Well, what would happen then is that Japan would accommodate to a system of independent societies, and there would be a co-prosperity sphere, but the United States wouldn't run it. And that was unacceptable. We had just fought the Pacific War to prevent that. And in 1948, the United States was not willing to lose World War II. That's why Indochina was important. And the reasons are perfectly clear. We want a global system which will be subordinated to the needs of U.S. investors, and you can't let pieces of it start unraveling, because if one of them works, others will go. The way that this appears in the documentary record, even the public documentary record sometimes, is quite striking. So take Allende in Chile. Chile's a fairly big place, but again, you know, the United States wasn't going to disappear if Chile became independent. Why were they so concerned about Chile? Well, you know, Kissinger talked about that, in this case publicly, because we don't have the secret records yet. He said that Chile was a virus which might have an effect all the way to Italy. Why Italy? I mean, he didn't expect Allende to conquer Italy. But what he meant was very clear. He said it's going to send the wrong message to Italian voters. If they see that a social democratic government can take over and succeed and do things, other people will get funny ideas. Well, you know, Italy, despite 40 years of CIA subversion, still has a labor movement. And suppose they get funny ideas about taking control of their own country and, you know, reinstituting the workers' councils that we destroyed in the 1940s and so on, they might be stimulated by seeing it happen in Chile. That's a virus that has to be eliminated. That's the thinking, and it's plausible thinking. I mean, the vulgar version of it is the domino theory. You know, the idea that Ho Chi Minh's going to get in a canoe and, you know, conquer California or something, or that the Nicaraguans are going to march on Texas. I mean, that kind of business. That's what everybody laughs about. And that's the version of the domino theory that's used to frighten the public. Maybe leaders believe it. I don't know. You know, it's possible that they believe it. But rational planners certainly don't believe it. They understand that the domino theory is correct, which is why it's never questioned. But it's correct because of the demonstration effect of success. That's why the domino theory is correct, and that's why it's never challenged. And that's why tiny little places pose such a threat and have to be crushed, you know, because pretty soon bigger systems start unraveling and the whole world becomes independent. Can't have that. I think the interests are very clear.